Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And today's going to be a little bit of a return to the traditional format. I've got three segments lined up here instead of just one. So, the main thing I'm going to be talking about to start us off is Ken Paxton and why he's a risky gamble for the GOP majority in Texas and possibly throughout the country. I just grabbed a drink of water there. So, some of the most powerful Republicans now warn that nominating Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton as their Senate candidate in 2026 could imperil the party's fragile grip on the U.S. House. Though Paxton secured statewide victories before, insiders tied to Senator John Cornyn, another Republican from Texas, argue that internal models and polling, both public and private, signal that Ken Paxton would be toxic in a general election. And this is according to some coverage from Axios as well. So a super PAC aligned with Cornyn commissioned a memo from the GOP firm called Deeproot Analytics. That document contends that Paxton's presence atop the ticket would erode Republican support among key demographics, especially independents, suburban voters, and women. So I have to kind of deviate from my script here that I wrote up and ask why a Republican woman would vote for any of these people. You know, it's just beyond me. I know the brainwashing is a huge factor here, just as it is in a lot of different areas of the world. But by this point, if you're a woman and you're still voting for these people, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. Examine your own thoughts and figure out if these people are actually the right ones to support. Because let me tell you, they're not going to support you. Okay. Anyway, the point is that if he loses support among those key demographics, he could thereby blunt the party's ability to pick up seats. And oh no, they don't want that. That's what they're about. They're about power more than any principles or anything like that. I mean, they do serve billionaires and multimillionaires. A lot of people just say billionaires like that's it, but no. If you have like $100 million, they'll care about you still probably then. But mostly billionaires and theocrats and assorted loons here and there, fascist movements, whatever. Anyway, the memo further warns that Paxton could doom Republicans in three of the five Democratic held congressional districts that Texas is targeting and threaten more than half a dozen GOP held seats. So, this is from the memo. I'm gonna quote that now. It says if Attorney General Ken Paxton is the Republican standard bearer, his presence at the top of the ticket could significantly weaken Republican performance in down ballot and congressional races. This dynamic could limit opportunities for GOP pickups while also endangering seats previously considered safe. End quote. So the Senate Leadership Fund, aligned with Senate Majority Leader John Thune, has joined in amplifying the analysis. Its executive director Alex Latcham quipped, "No one appreciates Ken Paxton more than Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries." End quote. So, I could get into this whole thing about how Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries are weak, but I'll let you figure that out on your own. I'll save that for a different episode. But anyway, Cornyn's camp has also dug into Paxton's personal and legal vulnerabilities, citing past accusations of corruption, misuse of office, and just for good measure, infidelity. Now, I'm not that much on a high horse about infidelity. People screw around, but the Republicans have this image of them being so pro family. They're they're all about man and wife and this the sacred bonds of marriage, yet they're out there cheating, just as much as the dirtiest dog you could find. You know what I mean? They're out they're practically out there humping legs, like a bunch of dirty dogs, like the lowest of the low. You know what I'm saying? Um, it's been proven time and time again, like the biggest homophobes out there are often the biggest closet cases, etc., etc. So Paxton has denied wrongdoing, of course, but on that note, when we're talking about his wrongdoing, here's a scandal that's not nearly enough. That's not nearly being covered enough. More people should be talking about this one. So, as one Newsweek headline noted, Texas AG says Trump would have lost state if it hadn't blocked mail-in ballot applications being sent out. So, in other words, Ken Paxton was in an interview confessing that Biden would have actually won the state if the if Ken Paxton hadn't blocked mail-in ballots being sent out, the applications. So basically, he admitted to deliberate subversion of the election. In a sane world, that might be considered a crime. They're deliberately preventing ballot applications. What? Why aren't more people raising a stink about that? And again, this did receive at least a little bit of mainstream coverage because Newsweek is obviously a mainstream source. You can find, or back in the days when print media was more common, you could find that maybe in your workplace break room or something, an edition of Newsweek and or similar publications. Anyway, a Paxton advisor defended his integrity, I guess you might say, noting that in 2022, the Attorney General won re-election by nearly 10 percentage points, evidence in their view that he can carry margin in statewide races. So let's look at redistricting and the House strategy and how this could be impacted by Ken Paxton if he runs. So behind this internal battle lies a larger strategic move. Republicans want to capture as many as 5 Democratic-held House seats in Texas through a mid-decade redistricting plan, one backed by President Trump. So the maps passed by the Texas House in August 2025 would tilt several districts in GOP favor, pending Senate and governor approval. And guess what? Texas's governor is most certainly going to approve the redistricting. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The plan is, of course, deeply controversial. A poll by the Texas Politics Project finds that only about one-third of Texans approve the redrawing. 41% oppose it outright. So, particularly damning is the finding that just 13% of independents support the changes. Critics charge that the map dilutes minority voting power, especially among Latinos, and many citizens see the maneuver as a partisan power grab because, well, that's exactly what it is. They're redrawing districts not in service of democracy, but to entrench one party's advantage. So, this is precisely the kind of concentrated political engineering we ought to reject. The state nesting its own electoral rules to guarantee favorable outcomes, whether controlled by Republicans or Democrats. The logic is the same, not politics as the people's expression, but politics as power maintenance. So, you know, if times were sane, there would be more of an effort to just stop these types approaches across the board. But however, as I've said before in a previous episode, if Republicans can do this in Texas, then Democrats should also be able to do their own version in California or wherever. If one party can bend or break the rules or just make them up as they go along, then so can another party. Like before, I compared it to how normally, I wouldn't go around chopping people up with an axe or anything like that. However, if somebody goes after me with an axe, well, I might try to wrest that axe out of their hands and then use their own weapon against them. Well, that's kind of the same premise here. You you use the opponent's weapon against them. Otherwise, you're being kind of a fool, right? You're just being a willing victim, really, if you're not willing to play by their rules to defend yourself. So, this is one of those things where one group's corruption is going to corrupt the other side as well. So, redistricting and geographic polarization have made U.S. congressional districts far less competitive, of course. The outcome is that fewer seats change hands even when public sentiment shifts. So, once maps are gerrymandered, the system becomes rigid, not responsive, and you might even say rigged instead of just rigid, because that's kind of what the intention is. The Republicans are even telling you that they're trying to rig the system in favor of the Republican Party. So what the polling actually shows, public polling on the Cornyn Paxton matchup is tight. An Emerson College poll from August 2025 puts Cornyn at 30%, Paxton at 29, with 37% undecided. So again, that's Emerson polling. And in a head-to-head general election scenario, Emerson shows Cornyn leading Democrat Colin Allred by 45% to 38%. So that's a sad thing to think about. You know, Colin Allred is, as far as I know, a solid candidate. So it just shows how right-leaning Texas is. So while Paxton's lead is narrower, 46% to 41%, it's still, five whole percentage points that Paxton would still have over Colin Allred. So really, with that in mind, the Democrats need to start pulling some rabbits out of some hats here if they want to overperform, so to speak. If they want to actually win, they really got to pull out all of the stops, and they got to stop messing around, because things are definitely not looking good. It's still a possibility that maybe Texas could become less of a red state and more of a purple state, as the saying goes, but it's looking a little bit far off. But anyway, other aggregators and analyses suggest that Paxton currently holds a lead over Cornyn in the Republican primary, and that kind of goes against what the Paxton critics were saying. And it might just be that they're just not a fan of Paxton. And who would be? Who in their right mind would be like a cheerleader for that guy? I mean, but putting everything else aside, he's just a politician. What's special about him? Even putting aside his scandals and all that, why would you be a cheerleader for him? What exactly? What does he have going on for him that is so exciting? I don't get it. But anyway, Real Clear Politics notes that Cornyn trails in early polling. Meanwhile, Cornyn has publicly defended the aggressive redistricting, arguing it can deliver national gains for Republicans. So, again, power over principle. They don't care about what's right or wrong. They just want to gain that additional power. Polls are like snapshots, not fate. So I don't want you to think that that all of this has been predetermined or anything like that. So when a candidacy like Paxton's carries huge liabilities, especially among swing voters or in competitive districts, the risk multiplies. So, what are the stakes, and what is the contradiction here? So, if Paxton becomes the GOP's Senate nominee, internal Republican warning flags suggest serious danger, losses in Texas House seats that could flip or weaken the majority in Congress. On the flip side, Paxton's campaign draws strengths from the hardcore right wing base and from those angry with Republican elites like Cornyn. Though make no mistake, Paxton is also an elite and would indeed also just cater to billionaires and multimillionaires, and also to religious fanatics and various fascistic types. And according to political analysts, this primary is emblematic of a broader internal struggle. You've got establishment Republicans versus populist conservative insurgents. But again, that's not the type of analysis that I really believe in that much. I would suggest to be skeptical of that sort of analysis because MAGA is the establishment in many key ways and always was. It was really just a far right rebrand of the same old bullcrap, only with more authoritarianism at the top. So, from an anti power perspective, the entire drama shows how political parties police their boundaries, enforce loyalty, and punish deviations, all to maintain dominance in the state. The so called elections we see are in many ways managed conflicts within the ruling class, with very little genuine break from elite consensus. Okay, moving on. I call this segment, I call this, son of a bitch. How come it ended up? And fuck, right off the fucking bat. So critics, like myself, charge that the map dilutes minority voting power, especially among Latinos, and many citizens see the maneuver as a partisan power grab, redrawing districts not in service of democracy, but to entrench one party's advantage. And this is precisely the kind of concentrated political engineering we ought to reject, the state nesting its own electoral rules to guarantee favorable outcomes, whether controlled by Republicans or Democrats. The logic is the same, not politics as the people's expression, but politics as power maintenance. However, as I have also said, if Republicans can do this in Texas, then Democrats should be able to do this in California or wherever else. If one party can bend or break the rules or make them up as they go along, then so can the other party. And I've previously likened this to how I normally don't go around hacking people with an axe, but if somebody comes after me with an axe, they're an axe murderer, and they're trying to, do their thing, trying to kill me with their axe, well, I might feel obligated to wrest the axe out of their hand and use their weapon against them. Well, that's a similar principle here. If they're trying to rig elections in Texas for the Republicans, then Democrats might want to use that same weapon against the Republicans. It's not a complicated thing to understand. If you're bending or breaking the rules, then expect other people to do the same. So, redistricting and geographic polarization have made U.S. congressional districts far less competitive. The outcome: fewer seats change hands even when public sentiment shifts. And you know how people are, they do change their minds. They're they don't call them sheep for nothing. Some sometimes they are pretty easily led in some embarrassing ways. So once maps are gerrymandered, why did I say gerrymandering? Gerrymandered, the system becomes rigid, not responsive, and you might even say becomes rigged, you know? So what polling actually shows is that the Cornyn Paxton matchup is tight, but unfortunately, both of them would potentially defeat Colin Allred, the Democrat. So that's not very good for the Democratic Party, and they need to start pulling some rabbits out of some hats if they expect to pull off a victory. So, you know, the uh, the simple fact is, Cornyn has publicly defended the aggressive redistricting, arguing it can deliver national gains for Republicans. So it's more about power than it is about principle. I always remember that. The Republicans, they don't have principles, they just want power. And just remember also that polls are snapshots, they're not fate. So, what a candidacy like Paxton's happens, it carries huge liabilities, especially among swing voters or in competitive districts, and risk can multiply. So, if Paxton becomes the GOP Senate nominee, internal Republican warning flags, again, they suggest serious danger, possible losses in Texas House seats that could flip or weaken their majority in Congress. So that's a significant thing here. On the flip side, Paxton's campaign draws strength from the hardcore conservative base and from those angry with Republicans' supposed elites like Cornyn. Although, again, make no mistake here, Paxton is also an elite. He'll try to claim that he's not, but he is, because he would also just cater to billionaires and multimillionaires, and also to religious fanatics and neo fascist types. So, the primary, it's emblematic of a broader internal struggle, so called establishment Republicans versus populist conservative insurgents. That's what a lot of the political analysts are saying about this, but I would be a little bit skeptical of that sort of framing of this whole thing because MAGA is the establishment in many key ways. It was really just a far right rebrand of the same old bullshit, only with more authoritarianism at the top. So, from an anti power perspective, a perspective that's critical of all of this nonsense, the entire drama shows how political parties police their boundaries and force loyalty and punish deviations, all to maintain dominance in the state. The elections we see are in many ways managed conflicts within the ruling class with very little genuine break from elite consensus. So it's really just people pretending to be, anti-elitist, or however you want to frame it. As far as the Republicans go, they're phony. They're putting on an act to pretend like they're actually rebels or something like that. When in fact they're just ultra conformists. All right, moving on to segment two. The peripheral poophead of the week, I'm bringing that back after 2 weeks of not having that segment. And this time we're going to be talking about John Cornyn, who is, frankly, a boring kind of person. So I want to look at basically how, even though he may seem less scandalous than Ken Paxton, I want to look at some of the ways in which he is still a scandalous figure. So John Cornyn III was born in 1952 in Houston. He's a longtime Republican figure in U.S. politics, so definitely not an outsider. He's occupied the U.S. Senate seat from Texas since 2002, making him one of the state's senior senators. Before that, he built a legal political trajectory, serving as a district judge, then as an associate justice of the Texas Supreme Court, then as Texas Attorney General. So he was definitely a ladder climber. Cornyn grew up in a military family. His father was a B 17 pilot in World War II. Or is that called B 17? I think I've heard it said as both. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Tell me the proper way to say B 17 pilot, or is it B 17? I think I've heard both. Because I say B 52 bombers, but is it different for how you say B 17, or is it B 17? Anyway, I don't mean to get too hung up on that, but he later served in the U.S. Air Force. The family relocated often, including a stint in Tokyo, where Cornyn attended the American school in Japan. So keep in mind, with all this immigrant bashing going on, they seem to feel like it's fine. These Republicans seem to think it's fine for them to be able to travel anywhere they want. It's others who should face a lot of restrictions, right? When it comes to freely traveling around the globe and making globally impactful decisions. It's bad for like a low level worker to be able to travel around freely at will. But if one of these people from these well off families with political ties wants to travel all over the fucking place, they can go anywhere they want. Well, how about that? How about that double standard, right? Oh, it's so sweet. It's so nice. Anyway, he returned to Texas and earned a BA in journalism from Trinity University in 1973. And guess what? He's certainly not, doing justice to the world of journalism by serving in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is increasingly going after free speech. So you have to wonder, like, is this guy going to be a hypocrite in every imaginable fashion? Probably. And he earned he earned a law degree and blah 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 blah, University of Virginia. You know, well, you get the idea. He had a pretty decent upbringing, pretty privileged. And in the mid 1980s, Cornyn won election as a state trial court judge in Bexar County and held that post until his move to the Texas Supreme Court in 1991, where he remained until 1997. He then stepped into partisan politics. In 1998, he was elected Attorney General of Texas, defeating Democrat Jim Maddox, who I'm actually going to do my third segment on. And he became the first Republican to hold the office since Reconstruction. So, critics, particularly civil rights groups, later noted that he failed to act swiftly in the Tulia scandal, which was a drug case in which many black residents were wrongfully convicted. So, yeah. When Cornyn ran for U.S. Senate in 2002, he won with about 55% of the vote and has been reelected in 2008, 2014, and 2020. You know, he was he chaired the National Republican Senatorial Committee from 2009 to 2013 and served as Senate Majority Whip during the 114th and 115th Congresses. So even though I said he's on the periphery, because he kind of is, people don't really talk about him that much. He's still somebody who's definitely had power, and he currently sits on influential committees such as Judiciary, Finance, and Intelligence. So even though he's not like a superstar, he's definitely influential. And though he may come across as boring, Cornyn's career typifies how power accumulates behind the veneer of public service. So he had a progression from judge to high office. It shows how these ostensibly neutral legal roles often serve as stepping stones for entrenched political actors. Also, his creation of enforcement bodies like the Internet Bureau really shows how the expansion of state surveillance and punitive apparatus under the guise of law and order is a thing. Meanwhile, he's a member of an increasingly lawless political party that does things like, bombing fishing boats and just claiming that they were drug boats or something like that, Just a very lawless uh, and corrupt political party, accepting Trump accepting a huge jet from the country of Qatar, or Qatar as it's sometimes pronounced, more plainly obvious corruption, and so on and so forth. There's a whole live golf tournament thing, which is another way of, gaining corrupt influence in the White House, and so many other things, so many emolument clause violations that Trump has done. I mean, you kind of lose count after a while. But anyway, his tenure as Attorney General was part of a broader right wing legal offensive in Texas, which some historians would argue helped shift the judiciary rightward and pave the way for state level assertiveness against federal oversight. And as senator, he worked to institutionalize the power of the security state, legislate on immigration and so called defense, and defend property rights, functions central to preserving capitalist and authoritarian frameworks. So, in the upcoming 2026 election, Cornyn faces a serious primary challenge from Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who accuses him of being insufficiently conservative, especially after Cornyn supported a bipartisan gun safety bill. Oh no, he can't have that. But the intra Republican conflict really reflects diverging visions of how political dominance should be maintained, either through technocratic consensus or overt ideological posturing. So, there's not that much of a huge difference there. It's just more of a presentation in many ways. They're both going to have a lot of the same agenda, but at the same time, that's how they're framing it. The what one is an insider, one is an outsider, etc., etc. So, one more illustrative episode. In 2025, Cornyn requested assistance from the FBI to pursue Democratic state legislators who fled Texas in protest to block redistricting efforts. Legal scholars warned that this maneuver risked federal interference in state politics and abuse of enforcement prerogatives, So, from an anti state lens, and keep in mind, Republicans pretend to be against big government, they kind of posture as if they are anti state power. But anyway, the act of wanting to involve the FBI against Democrats who had the legal right to break quorum, it really shows how centralized power can be turned against political dissenters using law enforcement as a weapon rather than a shield. And you know the idea that you can spontaneously claim that breaking quorum is a law violation, it just shows how they're willing to make up the law as they go along. Because technically I'm pretty sure that you can break quorum. It's something that Republicans probably did a time or two. Anyway, John Cornyn's professional arc is a case study in how legal institutions, electoral systems, and enforcement mechanisms can intertwine to reproduce elite power. He's not merely a senator from Texas, he's a node in a network of state authority, the judiciary, and party machinery defending the status quo against challenges from below. So, he's not an outsider. He is very much entrenched in the political machine. So, on to the third and final segment of the week as I continue battling this cold. So, this is the fetid fever dream flashback of the week, and we're looking at Jim Maddox, who, frankly, you probably never heard of if you're, even somebody who's been paying attention to politics, you might not have heard of this guy. I only am covering him because he's related to these other two figures here. John Cornyn, he's related to the history of John Cornyn. So in 1998, Cornyn won the general election with 54% of the vote, and he defeated Jim Maddox, a former Texas Attorney General and U.S. Representative. So, who is Jim Maddox? Well, he was a Texas politician who served as a U.S. Congressman and later as Attorney General of Texas. His biggest scandal came in 1983 when he was indicted on commercial bribery charges. So, the scandal, in plain terms, from what I understand, Maddox was accused of pressuring a Houston businessman, John Fullenwider, not to pursue a lawsuit against Maddox's sister over an oil and gas deal. So, how about that? The claim was that Maddox threatened to use his position as Attorney General to make life hard for Fullenwider or Wider if he didn't back down. So, Maddox was indicted, went through a high profile trial in 1985, and was acquitted. Still, the episode tainted his reputation and became political ammo against him later on. So, I'm going to look at this from what I call an anarchic perspective. The dreaded critics of power who view the whole thing as a charade. So, how might a scandal like this sort of feed into the anarchic critique of power? Well, an anarchic critique wouldn't just weigh guilt or innocence, it would focus on what the scandal reveals about power, hierarchy, and the state. So, we really might have an example of selective justice here. The state framed Maddox's case as bribery or influence peddling, but those pesky anarchists would point out that the entire political system runs on influence trading, lobbying, campaign contributions, backroom deals. These are normalized forms of coercion and pressure. You might even say they're legalized bribery. Son of a fucking bitch. You might even say the system routinely engages in legalized bribery. So Maddox just got caught stepping outside the legal channels of the same behavior that is normally acceptable. So it's power over principles. The trial wasn't about justice for ordinary people, it was a power struggle within the political class. Prosecutors, rivals, and the press used the scandal to cut down a rising figure. So, for those wacky, silly billy anarchists, this shows that rule of law often functions as a weapon for elites to check each other, not as a shield for the public. Although, maybe in a roundabout way, it can sometimes act in that way. I don't know, it depends on your point of view. But it is a little bit also about state violence in miniature. At the core, the accusation was about Maddox allegedly saying, "Do what I want or I'll use state power against you." So the anarchist types see this as just a smaller version of what the state itself does all the time, using force and threats to shape behavior. Whether it's taxation, regulation, or policing, coercion is the baseline operating mode. So I personally don't think all regulations are bad, and I'm not even 100% against the idea of taxation or policing or whatever, because every society has some sort of political system. You know, every society has, police functions. The question is, what form will they take? And it seems they often take a corrupt form, doesn't it? So, also keep in mind, acquittal does not necessarily even equal innocence. The jury cleared Maddox, but those goofball anarchist types would highlight how the outcome depended on expensive lawyers, political networks, and media narratives. So, working class defendants facing the state don't get that same amount of leeway, do they? So his acquittal reveals the uneven terrain of justice under hierarchy. So, from that psychotic, lunatic, anarchic view, the Maddox scandal isn't about one man's wrongdoing. It's a glimpse into the routine corruption baked into political office itself, where law is less about ethics and more about who has the leverage. Who has the leverage to twist it. And, well, that's about it for today's episode. I do apologize for my cold. I had to actually stop recording a number of times to get some water because of my throat and because of phlegm problems. So, hopefully you were able to tolerate my voice because it's even worse than normal. Hopefully, when I'm back next week to record an episode, my cold will be basically gone, I hope. So, anyway, have a good night or a good day, whatever time of day it is.